Okay, students, in this presentation, what we're going to take a look at is the Mexican independence, the war, the U.S. war with Mexico, and the aftermath. And then you're going to, once you finish this presentation, I'm going to ask you to read on the Mexican experience between 1850 and 1900 in the United States. And then this presentation, combined with the other presentations on native traditions and the Spanish colonial past, as well as that reading, will form the basis for discussion board 5. Okay, so when we take a look at 19th century history of Mexicans, it is one filled with violence. Mexicans in Mexico will not know peace between 1810 and 1920. There are all of these different experiences with violence: the Mexican independence movement, the Alamo, the Texas question, the annexation of Texas, the United States war with Mexico, the French occupation, the movement to oust the French, the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, known as the Porfiriato, and then the Mexican Revolution. So for over 100 years, Mexico and Mexicans are going to experience calamities, setbacks, intense struggles, and most importantly, tremendous territorial loss. So Mexican history is incredibly amazing given the adversity. Every struggle reveals the dance of good against evil, of anti-democratic forces pitted against progressive reform, of the eagle devouring the snake perched on a cactus, the emblem of the Mexican flag. Now, on September 16th, Mexicans celebrate a day of national identity, and in 2010, Mexicans in both Mexico and the United States celebrated the bicentennial of the independence movement. Let's take a look at a film clip from a government-sponsored documentary that prepared Mexicanos and Chicanos for the celebration.
All began with a call, with Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla urging on the people of New Spain to fight for their independence.
But history unfolds for a reason. Several events in Europe and America lead up to Father Hidalgo's call.
The winds of freedom are sweeping through the world. A war of independence is being fought in the United States to free itself of England, and the French Revolution seeks to cast off the tyranny of the king. These wars reaffirm the right of all people to fight for their freedom, for equality, and the right to elect their own governments. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invades Spain and takes Charles IV and King Ferdinand VII as prisoners. This unleashes a war against the French and brings instability to the Spanish colonies.
At this time, New Spain is the Spanish Empire's most prosperous territory, but its wealth benefits the Spanish crown more than it benefits the colony itself, which angers those who live there.
Several clandestine groups form to begin the independence movement. One of these conspiracies sets off the war. The meetings of Miguel Hidalgo, Ignacio Allende, Juan Aldama, and Josefa Ortiz de Domínguez in Querétaro are discovered.
Hidalgo goes to the church in the town of Dolores and calls on the people to overthrow the government of New Spain.
With a standard of the Virgin of Guadalupe as their flag, the rebels win their first victories over the troops loyal to the king, which are defeated in the bloody battle at the public granary, the Alhóndiga de Granaditas in Guanajuato.
The rebels are unstoppable on their march to Mexico City, but after the Battle of Monte de las Cruces on the outskirts of the capital, Hidalgo decides to retreat despite his victory there. The independence forces occupy Guadalajara. There, they try to organize a government. They start a newspaper, El Despertador Americano, and they proclaim the abolition of slavery.
But royalist forces under the command of Felix Maria Calleja follow in close pursuit. The two armies engage in combat outside of Guadalajara in the Battle of Calderón Bridge, where the rebels suffer their worst defeat. Fleeing north, Hidalgo, Allende, Mariano Jimenez, and Juan Aldama are ambushed and taken prisoners in Acatita de Bajan, Coahuila. Later, they are tried and executed in Chihuahua.
After the death of Hidalgo, another parish priest takes command, José María Morelos y Pavón. The high point of his military career is breaking the siege of Cuautla, where 7,000 of Calleja's troops had kept Morelos and 3,000 rebels under siege for 72 days.
In addition to his military genius, Morelos is a visionary who seeks to provide the new country with a political organization. He assembles the Congress of Anahuac and reads there a document entitled Sentiments of the Nation.
In Apatzingan, Congress adopts Mexico's first constitution, which establishes the country's political structure and a division of powers into the legislative, executive, and judicial branches.
But soon after, Morelos begins to lose his battles. In 1815, he is taken prisoner, tried, and executed.
In 1817, the independence movement was losing momentum when a liberal Spaniard, Javier Mina, gave it new impetus by arriving in Mexico with 300 men to fight with the rebels. After a bold campaign, he is trapped and shot in the back, accused of betraying his homeland.
An event in 1820 changes the course of history. Spanish King Ferdinand VII accepts a liberal constitution, which eliminates many of the political, economic, and social privileges enjoyed by the Spaniards living in the colonies. This accelerates the move towards independence in Mexico. Creoles, Spaniards, mestizos, the indigenous population, and other elements of society all fight for the same goal, although for different reasons. The War of Independence ends when Vicente Guerrero, the most well-known rebel, and Agustin de Iturbide, a Creole at the head of the Royalist army, seal a pact with the embrace of Acatempan. With the Plan of Iguala, or the Plan of the Three Guarantees, Iturbide proclaims the independence of Mexico. After 11 years of fighting and 3 centuries of domination by Spain, Mexico emerges as an independent nation.
History belongs to everyone. Bicentennial of Independence, Centennial of the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican government.
Okay, what is important to remember about the Mexican independence movement is that it was a movement to end racism, a movement to end the caste system. And if you notice the color of the peoples who were fighting, first it was Miguel Hidalgo, who was a Creole priest. He was working with indigenous peoples. The majority of the population were people of color in Mexico. And it was the white elites that tried to preserve their privileges. And what happened was, again, the Spanish elite allowed for a liberal constitution, and that encouraged the white elite to lay down their arms and join the people of color to create an independent Mexico. If you notice Vicente Guerrero, or if you noticed the other characters outside of Miguel Hidalgo were Afro-mestizos. Jose Maria Morelos y Pavón was another priest, and he was Afro-mestizo. And likewise, Vicente Guerrero was never conquered or defeated, and he led El Ejército Negro, or Moreno, I'm sorry, El Ejército Moreno, which was the Dark Army. He led an army of slaves and Africans who were fighting for independence and the elimination of slavery. So this is what's going to be contentious in Mexican politics, is of course allowing people of color in government. Now the United States is different. They will create compromises to not allow Africans and people of color into the system. It will be a nation for white males. But in Mexico, everyone was involved in trying to see if they could end the casta system. And Mexico is going to have to come to grips with racism within its own government. But what's going to happen is, in order to attract market activity to its northern frontier, Mexico opened its borders and allowed American immigrants to come into Texas. And they came in waves to take advantage of the cheap land that was made available by Mexico. In fact, Mexico offered more opportunity to Americans than the United States offered to its own citizens. But the lax policies of Mexico provided opportunities to people who had no interest in honoring the Mexican Constitution, much less becoming citizens of the Mexican nation. So Mexico stopped its immigration policy, but did not provide sufficient funds to create an effective border patrol, because Americans, border or no border, were coming to occupy the land. And so these first illegal aliens are then going to protest against Mexican rule, especially when Vicente Guerrero gains the presidency and abolishes slavery. So how does one want to remember the Alamo? Land, borders, slavery, and territory. The Alamo erupted over these issues, and Texas declared its independence, yet the historical record reveals that Texans had no interest in being an independent nation. They wanted to be annexed by the United States immediately, but the nation had to wait for an administration that was willing to annex it. The nation is going to be funded by the South in its 9-year existence, and in essence, Texas was an extension of the Southern cotton economy. And Texans desperately waited a U.S. administration that was willing to annex it, and that administration arrived in 1844. Now, let's appreciate the United States war with Mexico. The war, when deliberated by Americans, is portrayed as an extension of the debate over slavery versus free labor. U.S. historians deliberately distort the people's experiences, and they couch the war in sectional rivalry. There is no attempt, even by the most liberal of writers, to look at the war in terms of human rights and its consequences to the people on both sides of the border. But the war is a terrible object lesson. It is an episode in a people's history. Why? Because Mexico lost. Mexicans lost. And you need to remember that, students. Mexicans lost. This event could not help but encourage people to take a hard look at where they were going and what they were doing. Now, there is a historical fate. A portion of the nation is to be outside the boundaries of the nation. And this fact is going to have further consequences in Mexican and Chicano history. Because as we know today, millions of its citizens live outside Mexico to this day. So the U.S. war with Mexico, though portrayed in U.S. history textbooks as an extension of the debate over slavery versus free labor, and couched in sectional rivalry, has to be looked at in terms of human rights and its consequences to the people on both sides of the border. The United States acquired a territory that was vital, and the legitimacy of its holding is a question that continues to be raised in the scholarly literature. So the United States acquired a people with a different sense of history, with a different culture, with a different linguistic heritage, with a different environmental orientation. This population was growing at the time of the takeover. It is growing to this day, and America needs to come to terms with its conquest. The United States became an aggressor nation, and the United States does not like to look at how it won this war. Now, you can lie to the school children, but the politicians are going to document for the record that this nation became blemished. There were clear material consequences for the occupation. Let's go to a film clip on the war from a documentary that's hosted by a famous person here from East Los Angeles, and that was produced by the History Channel.
This was the war that Abraham Lincoln called unconstitutional, and Ulysses S. Grant labeled one of the most unjust wars ever waged. But the president who waged it, James Polk, believed the U.S. had ample cause. Known as Mr. Polk's War, its goal was to expand America's border to the Pacific by taking nearly half of Mexico's territory. It was the first battle for West Point graduates Ulysses S. Grant, George McClellan, and Robert E. Lee. But ultimately, it was a clash of politicians and of soldiers that dramatically changed the fortunes of two neighboring countries.
Fire! ¡Abra fuego!
The Mexican-American War.
Hello, I'm Oscar de la Hoya. I am standing at the spot where the final and decisive battle of the Mexican-American War took place. It's one of the most historic landmarks in Mexican history, the Castillo de Chapultepec. Today, as then, the war remains a source of controversy, one that I can deeply understand. I am a citizen of both countries. My parents were born in Mexico. I was born in the United States of America. In 1992, I had the honor of winning an Olympic gold medal for the USA. In my heart, I want it for both nations I consider home. Join me as we examine the Mexican-American War from both sides, why it began, how it was fought, and why it ended the way it did.
Okay, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is going to bring this war to an end, and it's going to establish the political boundary that we know as the U.S.-Mexico border today. And through it, a huge region that was formerly Mexico now became the United States. Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and California now became the property of the United States. And the most noteworthy articles concern the protection of land grants and cultural rights of both Mexicans and Indians living in the region. Now, the treaty protected land grants and tenure rights that were established during the Mexican and Spanish periods. And the treaty guaranteed legitimate land titles to those who could prove their holdings in Texas, in New Mexico, in Colorado, in Arizona, and in California. Cultural customs were to be given equal consideration, and Mexicans and native peoples were not to be discriminated against as they took up citizenship in the new country. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo guaranteed that Mexicans and native peoples would be citizens of the United States. And the border created from this treaty now turned the Mexican migration experience into immigration. Mexicans from now on were to be immigrants. Now they immigrated to their occupied country. Now, what's most important to appreciate is that the United States would violate every stipulation of the treaty, and it would not give citizenship to neither native peoples or Mexicans, and Africans who were part of the Mexican experience were enslaved. So the United States was not going to honor its word with regards to the treaty, just as it never honored any word with regards to treaties with native peoples. And then something tragic is going to happen from Mexican history. There's the matter of Mexico being occupied by the French. After all the struggles to keep the nation afloat, Mexicans now had to deal with the French coming to take over their country. So Mexico was a vulnerable country in the 19th century. It was invaded by two powerful nations, the United States and France. And Napoleon III invaded Mexico while the United States was preoccupied with its civil war. So one of the most important heroes of Mexican national history is Benito Pablo Juárez Garcia. He was Zapotec from Oaxaca, and he was the first indigenous person ever to serve as president of Mexico and to lead a country in the Western Hemisphere. He resisted the French occupation. He overthrew the empire, and he restored Mexico, and he introduced land reform efforts in order to help the poor. So Benito Juárez's liberal efforts to modernize the country challenged the conservative elements that sought a continuation of the old colonial system of casta privileges. Today, Benito Juárez is remembered as being a progressive reformer dedicated to democracy, equal rights for his nation's indigenous and Afro-Mestizo peoples, and the lessening of the political influence that the Roman Catholic Church then held over Mexico. Most importantly, he defended national sovereignty. So the period of his leadership is known in Mexican history as La Reforma. His rule implemented the independence agendas of Hidalgo, Morelos, and Guerrero. Now, one of the reasons Cinco de Mayo is celebrated in the United States is that, and it's celebrated more in the United States than it is in Mexico, is simply because the Chicano movement in the 1960s, the Mexican civil rights movement of the 1960s, is going to use Cinco de Mayo as a day of protest, as a day of organizing demonstrations to demand the civil rights for Mexicans in the United States. And Cinco de Mayo was used deliberately by the Chicano movement because Cinco de Mayo was a remembrance of an occupation. And in this particular case, the United States occupying Mexico and not honoring the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in giving Mexican people their civil rights. So Cinco de Mayo, again, that's one of the reasons why it is celebrated in the United States. In the 1960s and 70s, it was a means of demonstration. But finally, by the 1980s and 90s, what's going to happen is Budweiser and Corona beers are going to take over the celebration. And so today it's Cinco de Drinko, just like St. Patrick's Day, I guess is. Although St. Patrick's Day likewise was also a day of resistance, to commemorate resistance, likewise Cinco de Mayo. So Cinco de Mayo is an event that all Mexicans should commemorate. Let's go to the History Channel to understand the importance of this particular day.
Cinco de Mayo, or the 5th of May in English, is a celebration of Mexican heritage. Over the years, many people have come to believe that it marks the day of Mexico's independence, and that's, well, just wrong. The 19th century was particularly brutal for Mexico. After a bloody struggle to win its independence from Spain in 1821, the fledgling country fought America from 1846 to 1848, and then a civil war beginning in 1857. These conflicts left Mexico's economy ruined and its army exhausted. The nation had accumulated war debt and just couldn't repay its European backers. Mexican President Benito Juarez declared a 2-year suspension on its loans. That news didn't sit well with England, Spain, and France. So in 1861, those nations planned an invasion, but France wasn't out for just reimbursement. Napoleon III wanted to overthrow the Mexican government and install a French monarch in the Western Hemisphere. When England and Spain realized France's true intent, they withdrew support. Napoleon believed that Mexico was too weak to defend itself against his superior military. In 1862, over 6,000 French troops landed at Veracruz and headed toward Mexico City. But a surprise was waiting. Mexican General Ignacio Zaragoza and a few thousand militiamen waited behind fortified walls in the city of Puebla. The French marched into town on the 5th of May. The outnumbered Mexicans opened fire, killing 1,000 French troops. After a 2-hour battle, the remaining French retreated. Word of the victory spread throughout Mexico, and Zaragoza became a national hero. Later that year, the city of Puebla was renamed Puebla de Zaragoza, and Cinco de Mayo was decreed a national holiday. But Napoleon wasn't celebrated. Upon hearing of his army's defeat, he sent 30,000 more troops to Mexico. Within a year, the Mexican army was crushed, and Napoleon installed his Austrian cousin, Archduke Maximilian, as the nation's leader. Maximilian's rule was shaky from the start. Most Mexicans were still emboldened by the Cinco de Mayo victory and celebrated the holiday with songs and dance while under French occupation. Mexico's future president, Porfirio Diaz, led an uprising in 1867 that finally overthrew the French army. Maximilian was shot and killed. His bullet-riddled shirt is still on display in Mexico City. Cinco de Mayo had become Mexico's rallying cry. People remembered it with feasts, mariachi music, dancing, and picnics. The celebration continues today, both north and south of the border. In fact, commercial interests in the United States have made Cinco de Mayo very festive, even though many people aren't aware that the holiday is a tribute to General Zaragoza and his nation's resistance against foreign domination.
Okay, so again, one of the reasons Cinco de Mayo is celebrated in the United States is to remind both Chicano and Mexican people of the commitment to liberation that Juarez engendered amongst the population. Cinco de Mayo is an event that everyone should commemorate, because we must commit ourselves to the struggle for human rights and dignity, as Benito Juarez insisted. Benito Juarez insists we stay vigilant of our rights. Entre los individuos como entre las naciones, el respeto al derecho ajeno es la paz, meaning that amongst individuals as amongst nations, respect for the rights of others is peace. It is inscribed on the coat of arms of Oaxaca. We must give honor to Benito Juarez's vigilance. Okay, so this ends the presentations for this folder on the Mexican experience. So I'm going to ask you to go and read on the Mexican experiences, read a chapter from a textbook on the Mexican experiences between 1850 to the Civil War, and then you will be prepared for a discussion board. Thank you very much.